The yard sale was the kind you find all over American neighborhoods on warm Saturdays. Folding tables with mismatched glassware, boxes of paperbacks, bins of baby clothes, and a woman in a sun hat arguing cheerfully over $2 like it would change her life. My son wanted the red scooter with one handlebar grip missing. He tried it, drifted in a slow circle, and then put it back without a word when he saw the box of toy electronics under the table. I knew the look. I grew up with cheap plastic gadgets that pretended to be serious, and in his hands he found a walkie-talkie with a cracked antenna cap and a sticky label that said Channel 7 in faded marker. It was a single unit. The box was long gone. The woman said the other one broke years ago. She shrugged the way people shrug when they are selling a piece of a memory they cannot finish and asked for $3. He looked up and I said yes because $3 is a price that buys a quiet afternoon. We put in fresh batteries from the junk drawer when we got home. We didn't find the back cover, so I taped the pack in place and pretended that was temporary. He pressed the talk button and said into the grill the first thing anyone says the first time they hold a walkie. "Hello, anyone there?" He said over like a kid who learned how to end a sentence from a movie. Static breathed back. That night after dinner, I turned the unit off and put it on the kitchen counter because I like order, at least in theory. My wife gave me a look that said we have enough noise in this house without adding small radios, and I told her it would be fun and safe, and I believed both because belief is easier when the plastic is light. At 2 a.m, I woke because a thin voice threaded the air and said, "Copy. Over." It wasn't a dream voice. Dream voices smear and repeat. This voice clicked in with a squelch and a tiny hiss, clear and close, and it spoke with the flat confidence of someone who expected me to answer. It sounded like a boy. It sounded like the walkie-talkie I had put on the counter turned itself on and wanted to be useful. I sat up, listened to the house. The air conditioner was off. The street was quiet. There were no TVs on. The red LED on the walkie glowed. I checked the kitchen window. The yard was empty except for our grill and the plastic slide we kept meaning to donate. The voice came again. The same boy, a little louder. "You ready to play? Over." I pressed talk because that is what your muscles do when the device in your hand asks you to become a person you once were. "Who is this?" The voice took its time. "Wrong call sign," he said. "This is base. You're Rover. You're late. Over." I said, "I think you have the wrong house." He laughed in that small way boys laugh when they don't want to admit they think something is funny. "House doesn't matter. It's the channel." Over. I said, "What channel?" He said, 7, privacy code 15, same as always. Over. I looked at the tiny LCD. It said 7 and a small 15 in the corner. I hadn't said either. My son hadn't either. The walkie had revived them from some old habit, or someone else on our street had dialed into the same numbers without thinking. I said, "We only have one unit." He said, "No, you don't. You're holding one." Over. He wasn't wrong. I asked, "Where are you?" He said, "Outside." Over. I said, "Where outside?" He said, "Same as last time." Over. I said, "Last time when?" He said, "Summer before this one." Over. I said, "What's your name?" He said, "You know my name." Over. My son's bedroom door opened and he padded into the kitchen, rubbing his eyes. He looked at the walkie, then at me, and then up at the dark window. The voice said softly, "There you are." Over. My son whispered, "Dad, that's for me." He reached, and in that hesitation you feel when a child is about to take something you don't understand. I nearly let the radio go. I didn't. I pressed talk and lied. Batteries dying. Try later. Over. The boy's voice sighed in a way that dimmed the little room around me. "See you at 7:05. Over. The radio went quiet. The LED held steady. My son blinked at me. He said that sounded like Liam. I said, "Who is Liam?" He said, "The boy with the striped shirt from the corner house. They moved in 4th of July, and then they moved out when school started. He said he had walkies and that he would find me on the channel even if I didn't have mine." I didn't know what to do with that sentence. I told my son to go back to bed. I sat with the walkie until 3, and when it didn't speak again, I shut it off with the kind of relief a coward earns. In the morning, the device sat on the counter with its little screen dark, and my wife laughed at me for making coffee like a man who had fought an appliance. I didn't tell her the details. I told her it made noise and scared the kid, which is too much truth and not enough. I went to work with a nagging sense that I had dropped a thread people tied for a reason. All day the radio lurked at the edge of my thoughts like a can you forgot to put back in the pantry. I drove home past the elementary school and saw the mural they paint on the wall with handprints and felt guilty for thinking it meant anything. At 5:37 I turned the walkie on before I had even taken my shoes off. The sound rushed in like a small wind. The screen read 7 and 15, nothing else. My son asked if he could talk, and I said not yet, the way a man says not yet to a dog that has not learned sit. At exactly 7:05 the squelch snapped and the boy said, "You're late, Rover." Over. I said, "This is not the kid you think it is." He said, "Do you need the code word?" Over. I said, "Sure." He said, "The code word is climber." Over. My son tugged my sleeve hard enough to make the plastic creak. He whispered, "That's right." I didn't let him take the unit. I didn't know why I wouldn't, and I didn't know how to explain the refusal to his face. I pressed transmit and said, "Where are you?" He said, "I told you outside." I said, "I don't see you." He said, "You're not looking." I walked to the window again and saw the quiet rectangle of lawn and street like a photograph. He said, "Look lower." I crouched. He said, "Lower." I knelt. He said, "Lower." I sat and pressed my eye to the little gap between the sill and the screen and saw that if you pressed enough you could see the crawl space vent across the yard near the foundation where the old lattice had a missing slat. Behind it, darkness like a mouth. The radio hissed. He said, "Found you. Over." I jerked back and stared at the vent and felt my stomach step into a hole in the ground. I said, "Come to the porch light." He said, "You come to the vent." Over. I said, "We can't play there." He said, "We always play there." Over. My son whispered that when he met Liam the day after the 4th, the boy wanted to crawl under our porch, and my son said no, because he heard raccoons once, and the boy had laughed and said, "There are no raccoons when the game is on." I asked my son why he didn't tell me, and he said, "You were grilling," and Mom said, "Keep the ketchup away from your shirt." I looked at the radio like it would tell me I had missed a parent moment with a sign. It stayed blank and patient. I went to the porch with the walkie and a flashlight because being outside felt like a step you had to take enough times to stay human. The vent across the yard was just a vent. Dry leaves clung to metal mesh, and the missing slat opened to a shallow crawl full of last year's trash and small bones no bigger than a pencil. The voice came close in the radio. "You brought your light." Over. I said yes. He said, "Don't shine it at me." Over. I didn't. I aimed it at my own feet and felt childish and mean. I said, "Liam, if that is you, come out." He didn't answer for 5 seconds. That felt like double that. Then he said in a smaller voice, "Is my mom there?" Over. I said no. He said, "Is your mom there?" Over. I said yes. He said, "She's not your mom. She is your kid's mom. Rover, come on." Over. I closed my eyes because the way he said that sentence had the ring of a thing I would not have noticed as a boy myself, and now could not forget. I said, "Does your mother know you're here?" He said, "I never left." Over. The word never is a trick when a child says it. It sounds like a declaration, and it means a lack of math. I told the empty air we should go back inside. The walkie said in a sing-song voice code word climber, and my son, who had crept to the door despite my attempt to signal him to stop, whispered climber back like a reflex. The walkie was faster than I was. The boy said, "See you." Over. The screen blanked for a second and then returned the same numbers. The vent remained absolutely a vent. I picked up my son and carried him in like a man carrying a cardboard box that says fragile, and wondered when I had learned to describe him like an object to make my fear easier to lift. We agreed to put the walkie in a drawer overnight, and then moved it to the freezer, like people do with haunted phones in movies when they do not know the number for a priest. I laughed when my wife suggested it, because her face demanded laughter, and I needed to give her that. At 2, the walkie said from inside the freezer, "I can see your breath too." And the noise cut right through the seal in the door, and the part of my mind that insists on physics. I opened it, and the little screen glowed cold and perfect. My son patted in because all kids hear their name even when no one speaks it, and he stood barefoot and said into the radio, "You're supposed to say over." The boy said, "You're supposed to meet me." "Over," I said into the grill firmly. "No." He said, "Bass never says no." "Over." I turned it off. It turned itself on. I removed the batteries. The LED stayed bright and indifferent. My wife said what is happening in a voice that tried to be neutral and was not. The radio said we made rules. Over. The hair on my arms moved the way it moves when the stadium crowd sings and you remember you are small. I found a small screwdriver and took the back off fully because my hands demanded something to do. The board inside was cheap and printed, the sort of thing you can replace with a soldering iron and an evening. There was no coin cell. Nothing on it stored time or memory without the AA pack I had removed. The LED glowed anyway. The speaker hissed. The voice whispered closer. "Channel 7 is easy. Privacy code 15 is easier." He switched to 7 and 0, and then to 7 and 38, and then to 4 and 4, and every time the numbers on the tiny screen followed him like a dog. I said, "What do you want?" He said, "Finish. Over." I said, "Finish what?" He said, "The game where you crawl and count and touch the beam and I tag you before you stand. Over." My son nodded too fast. The shape of his nod was 9 years old. I said, "We are not playing." The boy's voice hardened. "Then we are not done. Over." I kept him home the next day because I am not good at pretending a threat against my kid is theoretical. I told the office I had a plumbing issue because adulthood is often explaining emergencies in a language that makes your boss less afraid. I searched the neighborhood while my son watched cartoons and my wife worked from the dining table with a headset that makes her look official about schedules. The corner house where my son said Liam had lived sat quiet with a realtor flyer tucked in the door jamb and a water ring on the stoop and a pale square on the siding where a family name had hung. I peered through the front window like a thief and saw an empty living room and a stain on the carpet that was probably iced tea. I went around back and found the small shed half open, and the inside smelled like wet cardboard that never dried. On a shelf sat a charger dock for a set of walkies like ours but nicer, the kind with rubberized grips and a tiny flashlight that blinks when you page. The dock was plugged into a strip even though the house's power should have been cut. On the left side of the charger was a sticker with 2 names in blocky marker, Liam and Ben. On the right side, the matching sticker had been peeled away so thoroughly it left only a soft rectangle that collected dust better than bare plastic. I pressed the page button and heard nothing, but when I went back to my yard, the freezer hummed, and the walkie in it blinked its LED in time with the dock I had left behind. The voice, too close to be anywhere but near, said, "You're cheating." Over. I called the realtor on the flyer. He asked whether I wanted to see the place. I said I wanted to know where the family went. He said he could not tell me that. I said a boy named Liam had left something with my son. He said he could not tell me that either. And then he lowered his voice and said, "Are you the neighbor who called about the basement light 2 streets over last month?" And I said, "No." And he said, "Good, because I do not have time to be 2 kinds of counselor today." I rang the bell at the house directly across from the corner property because those neighbors always know. And an older man in a baseball cap looked at me and saw a father and said, "We tried to help. We really did." He said a storm blew up the first week of school and kids were still outside, that 2 boys were playing hide and seek with walkies. That one went under a deck 2 houses down and didn't answer when they yelled because the deck had a hidden drop to the old crawl from before the addition. He said by the time they pulled him out, it was too late, and the ambulance lights seemed to wait too, and the other boy moved away before the leaves changed. I asked for names. He said he shouldn't. I did not press. I thanked him. I walked home with the dawning understanding people get when they realize the story they are in began before they entered the room. That night the voice came at 7:05 and did not pretend it was a game. "Come outside," he said. "Crawl, count, touch the beam, I'll tag, over." My son stood next to me with bright eyes because children worship rules and the way you pronounce them. I said no. The voice said, "Then I'll come in." Over. The air in the kitchen cooled the way it does right before a thunderhead breaks. The walkie hissed a baritone static like someone dragging a bow across a cheap cello. The radio said through grit, "I can fit." Over. I said not tonight. He said then, 7:05 tomorrow. Over. I said never. He made a small sound that might have been the word already, not quite spoken. The LED went dark. The screen went dumb. The house waited. Sleep was a rumor. At 2, the walkie on the counter without batteries flashed. 7:15 and my son sat up in the doorway as if a string pulled him. The radio said, "Let me show you something." Over. I carried my son back to bed and stayed until he slept because presence is one of the few spells we know. In the morning, I drove to the big box store and bought a brand new pair of walkies that promised a 35-mile range printed in proud font and set them up on the table with fresh batteries and chose Channel 7 Privacy 15 and pressed call on one while watching the old yard sale unit sit indifferent. The new one chirped its pretty tone and the old one did not. I pressed transmit on the new and said into it with foolish ceremony, "This is base. This is the only base. Confirm. Over." The yard sale radio spoke in the boy's voice that was now a little more impatient and a little less like an echo. "You keep changing your voice and it keeps being wrong. Over." In the new radio speaker, I heard my own sentence come back to me like I was talking into a canyon. There was no boy. There was only me, multiplied and delayed. I said into the new unit, "Where are you?" The old one said, "Where are you?" and it would have been a trick you could solve if the old unit had not added over at the end in a cadence that was not mine but had learned mine well enough to lean on it. I took both devices to the crawl space vent because fear builds an itinerary and you follow it to keep moving. I lay on my stomach and shone my light into the gap and saw fresh scrape marks on the beam where tiny elbows had braced, a trail of crushed dry leaves, a red plastic bracelet half buried in dust that said, "Field Day," in block letters. On the new radio I said, "I can see the beam." The old radio said, "I can see the beam," and the second half of the sentence tilted into a different voice for one word. The word beam was not my sound. It had a small upward lilt at the end like wonder disguised as a question. I said, "Liam, if you are there, tell me what you want my son to do that you could not." He said, "Finish." I said, "What happens when he finishes?" He said, "Then I'm done." I said, "What does done mean?" He did not answer for a long time, and then the old radio said in that careful tone kids get when they copy adults so precisely it becomes a parody it means I can stop waiting. Over. My son crouched near my hip and stared at the gap as if there was a movie inside it and said, "Dad, it's my turn." And then he paused as if hearing his own bravery and added, "Over." The way he said "over" broke me. I stood and told him in a voice I hope he will remember as serious and not cruel that the game was canceled forever. He said, "You don't cancel games." I said, "I just did." He cried in the tight way kids cry when they want you to understand that fairness is a ship. You scuttled on purpose. At 7:05, the radio said one more chance. Over. The street was empty. The light at the corner clicked from yellow to red to green with no cars to serve. I said into the new unit, "No." The old unit said no, and then said fine, and then the kitchen lights dimmed in a smooth, rippling way, as if a heavy bird flapped past every bulb at once. The air smelled faintly sweet like fruit turned in a pantry. The old unit said softly, "Then we'll do it in here." Over. I moved without elegance. I picked up my son and told my wife we were leaving, and she did not argue the way people do not argue when the rules of the house have rewritten themselves in the gaps between words. We went to a motel by the highway with a number in its name, and a clerk who gave me a look that said he had seen an entire town's worth of stories at check-in, and mine was nothing special. I left the old unit on the kitchen counter with its back off and no batteries in, and the new pair in the trunk. At 2, the motel room filled with a thin buzz, and the brand new unit in my bag lit 7 and 15 without being touched. The voice said in that close, polite whisper, Found you. Over. My son sat up and reached in the same motion, and I held his hands and said, "Go back to bed," and for once he did, because the tired was deeper than the rules. The radio spoke quietly. Counter doesn't stop the count. Over. I did not sleep again, and the sun rose the same color as a bruise. I called the older neighbor from across from the corner house because he had already talked to me once, and sometimes one person is enough to keep your feet aligned with the sidewalk. He invited me to his back porch and poured coffee that tasted like it had been sitting since the second inning of a ball game last season. He said, "You can't fight a thing that keeps a schedule with yelling," and I said, "Then what?" He said, "You have to finish the story the way it wants to end and then make a new story big enough to live in anyway." I said I was not going to put my kid in the dirt with a voice and an old beam, and he said, "That isn't what I said." He said, "Bring something the boy is waiting for and offer it to him, and then tell him the game is over because you were late and because that is the rule from now on." I said, "What if he refuses?" The old man stared at the fence like fences know more than they tell and said, "Then you move." I went home in the middle of the day because the light makes cowards brave. I set the old walkie on the counter like a place card at a table, and I reached into the crawl and pulled out the bracelet and scrubbed it under the faucet until the dirt lifted and the red showed like the inside of a ripe apple. The radio hissed and the numbers slid to 4 and 4 and then back to 7 and 15 as if the channels were a nervous habit. I pressed transmit on the new unit and said base to rover. The old unit said base to rover in my voice, and then fell into silence that was not static. I said, "I have your bracelet." The old unit said, "I have your bracelet," and then the last two words came back different, smaller, and not mine. The boy said, "Can I have it?" Over. I said, "Yes." He said, "Where?" Over. I said, "In the open, not the crawl." He said, "I can't." Over. I said, "Then you will have to be done without it." Over. The house paused as if thinking. Then the radio said 7:05. Over. I said 7:05 on the porch. He said 7:05 at the beam. Over. I said no. He said 7:05 at the beam or not at all. Over. My mouth went dry. I wanted to call the older man again. I wanted someone to tell me there was another option besides letting time and a dead boy dictate my evening. I put the bracelet in my pocket and looked at the crawl and turned on the porch light at 4 in the afternoon because ritual makes a man feel like a father. At 7:02 the air turned sweet. At 7:05 the old unit crackled with a noise like someone rubbing a balloon. The voice said, "You're late," in a tone that contained both patience and a kind of cold joy. I said, "I brought it." He said then, "Come crawl." Over. My son stood inside the storm door and pressed his palm to the glass like a boy watching a boat leave without him. I lay down and shoved my shoulders into the gap and stopped, because the dirt pressed my ribs in a way that made my lungs small. I held up the bracelet and said loudly so the memory would hear me, because I could not see what needed to see me, that the game is over and you were brave and you waited, and that is enough. And the walkie said, "The game is over and you were brave and you waited, and that is enough." And for the last 6 words, the voice belonged to the boy entirely. A small pressure lifted. The lights stopped breathing. The house sighed. The old walkie screen went blank and stayed blank for the first time since the yard sale. I crawled back and sat on the step and cried in the undignified way men cry when they did not realize they were holding a rope, and were finally allowed to drop it. My son opened the door and stepped out and put his head against my shoulder and said over like a prayer, and I said over back, and we both laughed because people sometimes need to be silly at the edges of horror to keep their shape. We slept that night. In the morning, the walkie on the counter looked like a broken toy. I put batteries in and nothing happened. I pressed the power button and nothing happened. I put it in the back of the cabinet with the buckets and the hand pump we keep for storms. I mailed the bracelet in a padded envelope with no note to the realtor's address with a memo line that said for delivery. I did not ask for a receipt. I stopped listening at 2 in the morning like a man weaning himself from a bad habit. A week later, a thin voice came through the new walkie in the hall closet that we had left off and said without static, "Thank you." It did not say over. It did not ask to play. It was a boy's voice, speaking not from a beam or a vent, but from a place that did not need my answer. Sometimes I still hear a click at 7:05 when the air is dry and the house is quiet. Sometimes the numbers flash 7 and 15 on a device with no batteries for the length of a blink, and sometimes I choose to call that a trick of light. My son doesn't ask to crawl under porches anymore. He learned that finishing games can be an act of mercy. We still keep the new walkies for hikes and fairs, and he still says over too much, and I let him, because there are worse words a boy can love. If you ever buy a single walkie at a yard sale and it answers back, don't play on its channel until you know whose turn it is. If a voice asks you to crawl, offer what it is waiting for instead. And if it says finish, ask what done means and make sure the definition leaves everyone